Good morning, everyone. My name is Austin. I'm excited to be here. I will admit, though, that I am not a morning person, so it seems like I'm still waking up. It's because I am still waking up. So thanks for bearing with me.
Thank you.
Get this going. So I'm excited to be here to talk about the role that technology is playing and technological trends are playing in shaping not just our energy efficiency programs here on the Cape and in Massachusetts, but also really the future of the grid. And I think it's appropriate we're under these lovely Eversource transmission facilities to give this talk. But I think that it's fair to say there's probably not something that is more important in our everyday lives than electricity, but that we also probably think less about. But the grid is going to play an incredibly important role in our future, and especially in meeting the challenges that climate change is presenting, and making sure that we can enable a clean energy future. So I'm going to touch on that today. Before I get started on that, just a fun Cape Cod fact, since we are here, it's going to be a little brand-centric. The Cape has its own footnote in green technological history. It was back in the 30s, a man named Tom Putnam sitting on his porch, probably in Truro, feeling that Cape Cod breeze and wondering why he was paying so much for electricity when the wind could produce it for free. So he set out to build the first grid-connected wind turbine, and he accomplished that in 1941. It wasn't on the Cape, it was in Vermont with a little bit of a steadier breeze. But I think it's really impressive because this is in 1941, and that was a 1.25 megawatt turbine. And I know that's a little technical sounding, but just for scale, the turbines you see when you cross Sagamore Bridge are only 1.5 megawatts. So this was pretty impressive for 80 years ago. Each blade, I think, weighed 8 tons. So I just thought that was a little bit of interesting Cape history there. I promise I'm not going to just talk about Cod Compact the whole time, but take a quick survey of the room. Who has heard of Cod Compact? Oh, that's impressive. Devin's doing a good job for us at Cape Cod Broadcasting. And who has heard of Massive? All right, that makes sense. So Cod Compact is the Massive sponsor for the Massive Energy Efficiency programs on Cape Cod and Martha's Vineyard. We are a public entity. We are comprised of our 21 member towns on Cape Cod and Martha's Vineyard and Dukes County. We're proud to be the first municipal aggregator in the United States. And importantly, we are the only non-utility Mass Save program administrator in Massachusetts. So I can't stress that enough. We are not a utility. I think it's important to understand that as I give this talk. But we do obviously work in the energy industry. We implement the energy efficiency programs on the Cape, provide a safe and effective power supply option that supports renewable energy, and advocate for Cape and Vineyard consumers at the state level, particularly in front of the Department of Public Utilities. We're located right in South Yarmouth, off White's Path, so if you're in the area, come by and tour the offices. So what I'm going to touch on today is 3 areas, 3 kind of places in time in terms of both energy efficiency and the grid. So where we've been in the past, a brief history of energy efficiency in Massachusetts, and the structure of the grid, which is past as just kind of the same as where we are now. The policies right now that are mandating or really driving a change in the grid, and on the flip side, the technologies and the technological trends that are enabling that change and getting us ready for the grid of the future. And so how those trends are transforming the grid, what that grid of the future looks like, and then finally we'll bring it back to the Cape in terms of what that means for our energy efficiency programs and how those fit into a future grid. And I do hope to leave time at the end for any questions and discussion. So first, just a brief history of energy efficiency in Massachusetts. The Cod Compact began implementing energy efficiency programs almost 20 years ago on Cape Cod and Martha's Vineyard back in 2001, after we were formed in around 1997. And from 2001 to 2010, our energy efficiency program budgets were relatively small. And that's because they were limited to the charge on the bill called the Systems Benefit Charge. And that was a line item that appeared on the distribution side of the electric bill, and it was meant to benefit the system through things like energy efficiency. And that amounted to about $5 million a year, which sounds like a lot of money, but when you're trying to implement energy efficiency across Cape Cod and Martha's Vineyard, it's actually not that much to work with. But that changed in 2008 with the Landmark Green Communities Act. And the most important part of that act, and it's a lot to read, is this line that all electric and natural gas resource needs shall first be met through all available energy efficiency and demand reduction resources that are cost effective and less expensive than supply. And that is our mission. It's the mission of all the Mass Save program administrators. And what that act did is not only set forth that mission, but it actually established a framework for achieving that. So we now file statewide 3-year energy efficiency programs. Each program administrator can propose changes to that, and the Cod Compact, especially as a non-utility program administrator, has the authority to go above and beyond what the other program administrators are doing in their plans. And importantly, it established additional funding mechanisms beyond just that systems benefit charge. And that is evident in the budget and expenditures of our energy efficiency program. So this is statewide 2010 to 2018. And I'll note that you can find all this on masssavedata.com. These are the energy efficiency program administrators, program budgets and expenditures through that time period. And I know this is a little hard to read on the left, but just to give you a sense of scale, the current 3-year plan, 19 to 21, statewide is almost $2 billion of ratepayer funding that is being invested in energy efficiency. And on the Cape, it's about a little over $140 million for our 3-year plan. So we're a small piece of it when you consider it in the context of statewide. And so here it is, the same chart for Cape Compact. So you can see in 2018, our expenditure is about $40 million of energy efficiency ratepayer funds that are being cost effectively invested. And it's been working. So energy efficiency savings across Massachusetts are shown here. These are lifetime megawatt hour savings. There are other ways to judge it. I don't want to spend too much time on these charts, but this is each year, this is how many lifetime megawatt hours we're saving through the measures that we install and incentivize. And the same chart for Cape Compact over that same time period. So at the end of the day, the message about energy efficiency is it has been working for Massachusetts customers. Statewide, we saved ratepayers nearly $23 billion over that time period, about $900 million for the CLC specific service territory. And it's evident in what's actually happening on the grid, because regional electric load is actually shrinking. And if you've been in the energy industry a while, this is unusual, because for years and years and years, electric load grew. As the population grew, as the economy grew, it was like a straight line, 3% a year is what utilities plan for growth. And what we're seeing in New England is actually because of energy efficiency, also because of behind-the-meter generation, our electric load is actually stayed flattened out, and now it's very slowly shrinking. Now that trend will change in the future for reasons I'm going to talk about in a little bit, particularly strategic electrification. But this chart from ISO New England makes it clear that energy efficiency is benefiting the region because we all end up paying for anything that gets built. And this is not to brag, but in Massachusetts as a whole has been ranked the #1 state in energy efficiency by the American Council for Energy Efficient Economy for 9 years in a row. And that's pretty significant. And just to be clear, we don't take credit for that. I think the reason I put it here is because it shows the level of seriousness and commitment that Massachusetts gives to its energy efficiency programs, and that we really are using energy efficiency as our first fuel. And I think it is impressive when you consider, we have California in the same runnings, right? And we beat them out for 9 years in a row, and they're pretty progressive on the energy front. So diving a little bit into technology now, I don't think there are going to be any surprises on this slide. So what we have on the right, I'm going to warn you that a chart on the right and text on the left is going to be a theme throughout this PowerPoint. But on the right, from the Energy Information Agency, is residential end uses of electricity. And so I understand it's a little hard to read, but the blue and the orange on the right are space heating and cooling and that's over 30% of our residential energy end use. This is nationwide, so Massachusetts does look a little different than this, and actually probably more on the heating and cooling side because of our variable weather, especially our cold winters. And then water heating is that gray area. Refrigeration, lighting, and are the two at the bottom, and then everything pretty much green and blue on the left side is plug load, basically. So that's your electronics and your appliances, your washers, dryers. We took our programs, our energy efficiency programs, were put from the bottom up in that we took this information and said, okay, here's how we need to design programs that are going to reduce this load. So we've done that through lighting in particular, has been a big saver of energy. From incandescent bulbs that were producing mostly heat rather than light, to those squirrely CFLs that people had a lot of mixed feelings about, and now to LEDs, and that's what we're installing, and those, it's going to be hard to beat those in terms of efficiency. Insulation and air sealing is the big one to reduce that heating and cooling load, keep the homes warmer in the winter, cooler in the summer. And we're doing that by incentivizing also more efficient boilers and furnaces for heating and heat pumps for heating, converting those to cold climate heat pumps. I'm going to talk a little bit more about later on. And then, of course, through appliances to meet those, reduce that plug load on the left of the chart, especially through more efficient refrigeration and hot water heating. So that's kind of where we've been in terms of energy efficiency. I don't think there's any surprises. How many people have had an energy assessment here? Okay, that's good. So, they've come to your house, they've told you, here's how much you need to insulate, they changed out all your light bulbs. I don't think anything on here is necessarily news to anyone that this is how we're getting our savings so far in this program, and this is where the biggest bang for the buck has been in terms of Massachusetts ratepayers and their investment in energy efficiency. But that is changing a little bit, as I'll get to later on. So now I'm going to switch over a little bit to the grid. So this is fortunately not the grid that we live in. For those of you that know anything about kind of the history of the grid, this is a DC power grid. And if Thomas Edison had his way, this is what our streets would look like. Unfortunately, AC power won, and we don't have 200 lines running down the street, as bad as we think it is now. But even though we don't have quite this many lines running down the street, the basic structure of the power grid really has not changed in 100 years. It was really a top-down grid. There was, back when they designed it, there was a large central generating station, and power flowed from the generating station across the wires to the various customers of the substation. And that basic structure that was designed 100 years ago is essentially what we still have in place today. Now it is changing, it's going to have to change for reasons I'll talk about. But when we talk about the grid of the past in a lot of ways is still the grid we have now. So what's changing that? Well, on the policy front, there are a few important changes that are enabling the grid to transform to meet our future needs. So the biggest one in Massachusetts is electric utility restructuring. I grew up in North Carolina. We had Duke Power, and your choices were Duke Power or Duke Power, and that's who you could buy your electricity from. And when I moved up here, and somebody told me, no, you can choose your electric provider, I said, how does that work? There's only one set of poles and wires. But after the wave of restructuring took place in the late 20th century, I think the electric industry was on the tail end of that. Massachusetts, I think, was the first in the nation to pass electric restructuring, or one of the first at least. And the idea of restructuring is essentially that you don't want your utilities doing resource planning for generation. Because the utility business model is you build it, you spend X millions of dollars, and you make a return on that investment, and a lot of return on that investment. And so there is a built-in incentive there for utilities to overbuild, or there was a built-in incentive for utilities to overbuild, and power plants are the biggest investment that you can make in your power grid as a single asset. So the restructuring was designed to get utilities out of the business of generating power and building those multi-million-dollar power plants, and essentially shifting that investment risk away from ratepayers and onto the private market. so that if we really did need another power plant, somebody would come along, decide they were willing to take that risk, they thought the need was there, and they would make the investment. And if it didn't pan out, we aren't stuck paying for it for the next 40 years. So this was important because we wanted to make sure that we were not continuously in this build mentality for power plants. It also necessitated, therefore, the creation of independent system operators or regional transmission operators, ISOs and RTOs, which I'll show you in a minute. But they are really the marketplace for electricity that had to be created in order to move away from the vertically integrated structure. Another big one, and this is relatively recent actually, is called revenue decoupling. So just like we wanted to get utilities out of the business of building power plants and selling power, we wanted to make sure at the end of the day, they're a business, they have to literally keep the lights on, that they are not motivated to sell more electricity to boost their bottom line. And so revenue decoupling is how we do that. We separate how much revenue the utility is allowed to make and how much money they're allowed to make from how many kilowatt hours they sell. And they can adjust. If they have a revenue requirement, they sell less kilowatt hours, they collect more per kilowatt hour, and vice versa. If they're selling a lot of kilowatt hours, they collect less. But at the end of the day, it's relatively stable in terms of how much revenue they're bringing in. And this is important because it fully removes one of the last barriers to really getting utilities behind energy efficiency and reducing that kilowatt hour load. Eversource did this in the most recent rate case. I think National Grid has a rate case going on now where they're doing it. So this is a relatively recent phenomenon, but it was put forth in Massachusetts law. And the last is performance-based rate making, which is PBRM. And this also took place for Eversource in their last rate case, where utilities are not just rewarded for selling kilowatt hours or providing, just maintaining poles and wires, but actually motivated financially to achieve public policy goals. A couple of examples of this are increasing renewable energy interconnection, reduced outage times, implementing smart grid technologies. So this is important so that businesses, the utility business, can make the changes necessary to adapt what we need as the public from our grid. So I just wanted to zoom out of Cape Cod for a little bit. I mentioned ISOs, RTOs. So we appropriately over here are in green. This is ISO New England. So ISO New England is the regional transmission grid operator for all of New England. We are part of a regional grid, whether we like it or not. And you'll notice here, I think this is interesting, that Massachusetts is separated into 3 load zones, whereas all the other states are 1. And this is related to the fact that Massachusetts, as a state, actually accounts for about 60% of all of New England's load. Most of the electric load is here in New England. So Boston, obviously, is the largest load center. Anyone can guess the second largest? Worcester. Worcester is actually the second, which I was surprised too. I thought it was convenient. And then
It's the second largest city in New England.
right, yep, exactly. Which I also didn't know. So on the right here is actually a little more detailed map of transmission facilities. You're not meant to read this. It's just kind of meant to give a visual representation of the flow of power across the region. Zoom out a little further. New England is one of 9 North American ISOs, 7 US ISOs, and everything in gray, I believe, are areas where there's still vertical integration. So this restructuring wave, just to make clear, did not happen across the country. So there's still got Duke Power down in North Carolina. Out west, still a lot of vertically integrated grid operators. And then zooming out just a little further from the grid perspective, we are part of one of 4 North American interconnections, part of the Eastern Interconnection. Just think it's funny on this chart that Texas has its own, literally its own interconnection. And I suspect they were leaving their options open for independence down the road. So my understanding, and I am not an expert at this level, but these are all grids. So even though we have our own grid, these are an outage on one of these could potentially affect what's going on in New England if it's within that same interconnection. So where are we at now? So we know, what the grid looks like, how energy efficiency has helped customers to date in Massachusetts, but there's policy drivers going on at the state house, both in Massachusetts and other states, and at the nationwide level, that is driving the change to the grid. So those regulatory changes, those three utility policy changes that I talked about a couple minutes ago, they really set the table to help utilities become partners in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and reducing energy use, because they got them out of the business of building power plants, they got them out of the business of selling kilowatt hours, and they incentivized them to achieve the public policy goals that are set forth by the legislature and department. And what Massachusetts has done is said, okay, now our utilities are ready to take this on. We're going to set some aggressive targets for reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. So the biggest one is the Global Warming Solutions Act. Requires an 80% reduction below 1990 levels by the year 2050. And that touches everything. That touches a lot of areas of Massachusetts policy, including our energy efficiency programs. Energy efficiency is actually one of the main ways that the state proposes to meet this goal, which they're mandated to do by law. Another one is electric vehicle transportation, which they have a lot more work to do. On the energy efficiency side, it talks about how the Green Communities Act requires the acquisition of all cost-effective energy efficiency. And then on the renewable energy side, there's a couple important ones. The Renewable Portfolio Standard, or the RPS, is the biggest. It is coupled with the Clean Energy Standard, and these are requirements that suppliers meet a certain amount, excuse me, of their load every year with renewable energy or clean energy in the case of the Clean Energy Standard. Clean Peak Standard is a new one. That's the idea that we want to make sure those hot summer days, that peak is met with renewable energy via storage, via renewable energy sources directly if possible, because that's when a lot of the emissions are. And then everyone in this room probably knows about the renewable energy procurements, the long-term contracts that the state has required of the utilities, including Vineyard Wind and Mayflower Wind, the offshore wind projects happening south and north of Vineyard, which I'll touch on a little more in a bit. And finally, and this is an important driver, is strategic electrification. You may have also heard it called beneficial electrification. And the idea of strategic electrification is that as we add more and more renewable energy to our grid, especially these large-scale projects, we want to make sure we're shifting as much of our end energy use to electricity as possible, to leverage that and take advantage of it and clean up our electricity usage. And so that is an important trend that is impacting the future of the grid that I'll talk more about. I also want to mention, these are not limited to Massachusetts. These are happening in other states, especially across New England. New England actually works together a lot as a region to accomplish our climate goals and has some unique regional structures in place to meet those goals. But they're also happening in other states and nationwide, but I will say that Massachusetts is, of course, one of the most aggressive states when it comes to clean energy. So what I want to focus on are the technologies, or the technological trends in some instances that I think are shaping the grid. When I sat down to do this, these were the 5 areas that I think are the most important in terms of where we're heading and the enablement of green technology on our grid, and what's going to be important to the grid in the future as we incorporate more renewables. So the first, of course, is renewable energy, particularly solar PV, solar photovoltaics, offshore wind, big in Massachusetts now, but then also energy storage and related electric vehicles. Finally, heat pumps, which are probably like the least exciting maybe on this list, but incredibly, vitally important for a clean energy future and strategic electrification. And then finally, something that is probably familiar to most people in this room, connected devices and the Internet of Things, which has application in the energy context as well. So on solar, I don't think, we'll do a quick poll. How many of you have solar on your home? Okay, keep your hand up. How many of you, other than somebody in this room, know somebody with solar on their home? And how many of you know of a solar installation on your street? Yes, just about everyone in this room. So while this may not be a representative sample of Massachusetts, I think it's telling and speaks to the fact that Massachusetts has been really aggressive in supporting the expansion of renewable energy even at the small scale. And partly because of that and other solar-friendly policies in other states, the cost of solar PV is rapidly declining. On an energy basis, which is what is shown here in this chart, it's actually becoming competitive. I think this is grid-scale solar, to be fair, but it's becoming competitive with those traditional energy sources. And that trend is really expected to continue. They're going to get more and more solar. I'll show in the next slide. In Massachusetts, just to paint a little picture of what's going on locally, so in 2003, and this is on Massachusetts Clean Energy Center's website, they have a lot of great data about solar, where it's installed in the state. The median installed cost of residential solar was $8.55 per watt. So that's kind of a unit basis on how you measure the cost of a solar installation. And this is residential solar. This is not grid scale solar. These are not solar farms. This is solar on your roof. In 2018, that cost was $3.79 a watt, so significantly less than half. And as of 2019, there are more than 89,000 residential solar installations in Massachusetts. 6,700 of those are in Barnstable County on the Cape. This is another chart from ISO New England, the regional grid operator. This is just to take a step back for a minute, their job is to keep the lights on in terms of the greater transmission grid. And that means they have to plan for that future because it takes a long time to build a transmission line. It takes a long time to build a power plant. And they want to make sure they're looking at 10 years down the road, even longer than that in some instances, to make sure that our resource needs are being met from a planning perspective. And then they basically put that out to bid and say, hey, we need a power plant here, here. Who wants to build it? What's your cost? They bid it in, and that kind of sets the price for capacity. So in order to project that need and to figure out how much power, they have to project what load is going to be, and they have to project things like energy efficiency and behind the meter solar, which impact that resource need. So in terms of solar growth, they project that every year. They put out a report with their latest projections. So this chart shows their forecasts in past years and the current year. And the black line, and it's a little hard to see, but the black line with the squares on it is what actually happened. And you'll notice that pretty much all the way through 2016, they vastly underestimated the amount of behind-the-meter solar that was going to be installed. I mean, 2016 is in green there, and it was low even in 2016. And it's, the line has really come away since then. Now they've clearly got better at it, the red, the blue, and the yellow. But I would expect that they're still probably under forecasting. Second, I want to talk about offshore wind. So this is a picture of Block Island Wind. I don't know if any of you have toured it. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. It's a really cool boat ride out there, and it's words can't describe what it's like being next to one of these on a boat. I mean, it's just so massive. This is the first offshore wind farm in the U.S. It became operational in 2016. As we know, Europe has had offshore wind for decades. This one is a relatively small project. It's 5 turbines, 30 megawatts, so 6 megawatt turbines off the coast of Block Island, Rhode Island. National Grid built it and uses the power from it. It powers the island in the summer, essentially, and probably is a net exporter on an annual basis of energy. But the bigger picture is that offshore wind is really picking up now. Liz and I were at a conference yesterday where we had a panel once again on offshore wind. It's like the hot topic in New England right now, but not just in New England. New York actually is moving in a big way on offshore wind. So all up and down the eastern seaboard, from North Carolina to Massachusetts, of course, states are in various stages of either investigating, in North Carolina's case, or actively developing, as in Massachusetts' case, offshore wind potential. We are kind of a gold mine of offshore wind, especially here in New England. Massachusetts utilities so far have procured 1,600 megawatts of offshore wind, so that's Vineyard wind and Mayflower wind. And I believe, I meant to verify this before I gave this presentation, I forgot, I actually believe we have another 1,600 megawatts authorized and planned. Yeah, I'm getting a head nod, so that's good. So 3,200 megawatts sounds big. New York is committed to almost 3 times that. Now they have a lot bigger load. They have their own ISO even. By 2035, and 2,400 megawatts of that they want to have done by 2030. So in the broader context, the Department of Energy estimates that the U.S. has a technical potential for offshore wind of about 2,000 gigawatts, which is about 7,200 terawatt hours of energy a year. So just to give you a sense of what that means, a megawatt is 1,000 kilowatt hours, and a gigawatt is 1,000 megawatts, and a terawatt is 1,000 gigawatts. So there's a lot of offshore wind potential there. Now that's technical, that doesn't mean that's what's going to be developed, but a lot of that technical potential is actually off the east coast rather than the west coast because of our relatively shallow shelf, ocean shelf. The other big technology driver is energy storage. So energy storage development is accelerating across the Commonwealth, across New England, and across the nation. And there are a couple of reasons for this. Number one, costs are declining rapidly. Now that's kind of a lockstep process. As you adopt more, costs come down. As costs come down, you adopt more. But the other piece of it is banks finally understand energy storage, or they're beginning to understand energy storage. These projects are becoming financeable, and that was a big barrier before, because before energy storage was a little bit ambiguous. Is it load? Is it generation? What kind of revenue can it bring in? What kind of grid services can it provide? And when you can't pin down a revenue stream, it becomes very hard to get a loan to do the project. But as states and the federal government have kind of codified the roles that energy storage can play, and the market opportunities for it, it becomes more financeable to banks and more projects can get done. And the other trend that this goes hand in hand with is renewable energy. As we all know, renewable energy is variable. So in order to really have a green grid, you have to pair it with energy storage. And so as more renewables get deployed, there are now a lot of incentives in place to pair that renewable energy with energy storage to better balance the grid and balance out that variable generation. Right now, lithium-ion is the dominant battery technology, but it is relatively short duration. 4 hours is about the sweet spot. And 4 hours is great for some backup power or peak shaving, but if we're going to really achieve 80 to 100% renewable penetration on our grid, we're going to need some longer-term storage options, and that is what is still being developed. We need to be prepared for days of relatively low renewable generation, and that's a challenge that's still being worked on. Some of the use cases, energy storage is accelerating across the board, not just across sizes, but also across customer types. So the biggest one and the most obvious one maybe to some people is the utility. So this is, I admit this is hard to read, but this is an actual map, thank you Eversource, of the project they have planned, the battery project they have planned for Provincetown. So the Outer Cape is served by one line. There's a lot of load up there in the tip of Provincetown. And in the summer, you have some power quality issues, and in the winter, of course, you have outage issues usually. And so they are installing a 25 megawatt, 38 megawatt hour battery in the town of Provincetown that in the event of an outage can serve the load down through Wellfleet. And their use cases are actually pretty straightforward for this. One, of course, to enhance reliability and power quality. But the other big one is to defer transmission and distribution upgrades. In this particular instance, it would have meant running a line through the Cape Cod National Seashore. Siting any energy facility in New England is difficult, especially when it's on federal land. And so this was kind of an easy way to avoid that, a relatively easy way to avoid that. On the Vineyard, they're also doing a project, and one of the primary purposes of that project is to reduce the amount of reliance on their diesel gensets down there, but also to incorporate more renewable energy. When you have energy storage, you can shift some of that generation that's pumping out in the middle of the day and even out those peak loads, which can sometimes cause distribution problems. Large commercial industrial customers are adopting storage, and they actually have probably the biggest suite of possibilities for what they can use their storage for. So it can of course provide outage backup and resiliency, but they also have demand charges on their bills oftentimes. They have access to time of use rates where they're charged different rates at different times of the day, so they can shift how much they're buying from the grid at those expensive hours to the less expensive hours. They're exposed to their wholesale capacity costs, so they can reduce those charges by discharging those batteries in peak times. And they can also actually participate in the wholesale New England markets and provide energy services to the grid and make revenue that way. So storage is a very flexible resource, and I would say that large commercial industrial customers have the most options in terms of taking advantage of that flexibility. And so we're seeing a large adoption in that customer group. But personally, what I think is most exciting is residential customers adopting storage. We have in recent years seen the availability of commercially ready residential scale storage that people are actually buying and putting in their homes. I was going to put a Tesla picture here, but we already had a Tesla picture, so I didn't want people to think I'm working for Tesla. I'm not working for Tesla. So I have Bigasonin, another one of the major providers. But the problem with residential storage units or residential rate structures is there's not as much inherent financial motivation there to adopt storage. They have less options. They don't usually have access to time of use rates. They're not exposed to demand charges, which is great. There's less use cases for storage at the residential level. It's really there to provide backup power and allow for self-sufficiency. But as I'll talk about in a bit, the grid is eventually going to need to call on those resources. And the one that I think is actually the kind of sleeper and the biggest impending challenge or opportunity to the grid is electric vehicles. Anyone in the room own an electric vehicle? All right. Anyone know somebody that owns an electric vehicle? Yeah, so I think 5 years ago, nobody in this room would have raised their hand. And the fact is, the grid is probably not ready for mass adoption in a short time frame of electric vehicles. But electric vehicle ownership is accelerating. And also transportation is the largest projected source of load growth in the electric industry. So when a lot of people start to buy electric vehicles, as they become more affordable, as there are more charging stations installed, the issue is where are people charging and when are people charging? Because if you plug in a lot of electric vehicles, even at night, there's what's called the neighbor effect, where you get solar, your neighbor is like, maybe we should get solar. If you get a Tesla, your neighbor's like, well, maybe we should get an electric vehicle. And that's great, but what that means is you have the effect of installing a lot of these technologies along one feeder line, and that can cause issues. So if you have a lot of people plugging in and charging their vehicle, especially in the middle of the day, that can cause distribution problems. And we're really not ready. The grid at scale is really not ready for that, but it does provide a big opportunity for load management because electric vehicles are essentially batteries on wheels. And so if you, as the grid manager, can call upon those batteries when you need them, that's a lot of available power right there. The least exciting but potentially most important one is heat pumps. So as I showed earlier on the other pie chart, space heating and cooling are the largest residential building uses, probably the largest commercial too. And Massachusetts has a heavy share of non-electric heating. We don't have much air conditioning yet, at least, which is probably good in terms of energy usage. But we obviously have more heating degree days than the nationwide average. And a lot of our residents are still on utility gas or fuel oil. Electricity, as you see, is a relatively small piece of this chart, maybe a fifth. And I bet you that most of that is electric baseboard heating, which is not very efficient. So heat pumps, in recent years, cold climate heat pumps have become more efficient to operate more efficiently in colder weather, which was a big challenge in the past, and more commercially available. The market is transforming. We're starting to see more adoption in New England. Mass save programs are really focused on this, providing rebates and trying to get those cited where appropriate. And this is probably one of the most critical pieces of that beneficial electrification, is moving people off of these fossil fuel-based heating sources onto electricity while we incorporate more renewable electricity to the grid. And the last one, connected devices. So there's a lot of interesting specs here. And these are actually, I think, a little over a year old, so these numbers I'm sure have gone up, but about a quarter of American households have at least one connected device. Raise your hand if you have a connected device in your home. Yep. All right. But I think the most interesting fact is 22% have 6. So if you have one, you probably have multiple. And importantly, in the context of this presentation, thermostat and light bulbs are usually 2 of those 6. Why are customers adopting this? Well, basically for convenience, they adopt them to save money, and they adopt them for safety and security. So 2 of those things are important for people who are interested in reducing load on the grid. Because the customer has already gone out and they've bought this connected device, they've installed it in their home, whether it's a smart light bulb, a connected water heater. Now, what you can do is you can say to the customer, hey, you already have this device. I want to call upon it on really hot summer days, turn your thermostat up just a little bit so we reduce that cooling load, and I'll pay you for that service. So we're starting to see a world in which customers for behind the meter storage with their Wi-Fi thermostats are actually starting to be able to provide grid services. We're still on the very beginning stages of that, but I think that's going to be like a bigger and bigger role in the grid of the future. So back to our residential energy and use chart. On the space heating and cooling side, we have Wi-Fi thermostats that are controlling that energy usage, and we actually this year are going to have a program to enroll Wi-Fi thermostats and pay customers to allow us to adjust them on those hot summer days just a little bit. For water heating, there are actually connected water heaters that you can go into Home Depot and buy right now, made by Rheem. There's not a lot of them out there yet. You don't replace water heaters very often, but as they become more widely available, that lifetime cycle, people are going to be installing these for their own convenience, and because water heating is such a big piece of that in use, I think they're going to become more important for grid services in the future. You're going to have smart refrigerators if you can afford one. This gets a little dicey in terms of whether we really would want to turn your fridge off for a little bit. We don't want food to spoil. But that opportunity does exist. And again, water heaters, refrigerators, there's not enough market penetration yet. There's not enough of these out there that it makes it worth it to control them relative to the load, because ironically, the more efficient they become over time, the less valuable they are for load control. But I think in the future, they're going to be really important as more and more people, the smart fridge becomes the standard one that you install. Smart bulbs, of course, are probably relatively common right now in connected households. And Wi-Fi plugs for everything else. So literally everything on this chart is touched by a connected device that you can go out right now and buy and install in your home or order from Amazon, more likely. And we as the energy industry are only taking advantage of a relatively small portion of this. But as I said, as more customers adopt these technologies, they're going to become easier, more cost effective, and more important for integration with grid services. So kind of the culmination of all these trends, technological, we're out of time, I'm sorry, is that we are moving away from one-way power flow to a more dynamic grid where we have a lot of these distributed energy resources, whether it's EVs, wind power, solar power, flexible load, that are causing two-way power flows. They're allowing customers to interact more with the grid. So this is because of electric load growth and strategic electrification from that transportation and heating and cooling sector, more renewable energy interconnection due to falling costs, and state mandates that are requiring more and more electricity to come from renewable sources. Grid-facing infrastructure investments that are enabling these dynamic power flows, especially grid modernization. There's a lot of grid-facing technologies that were approved as part of Eversource's grid modernization proceeding. And these behind-the-meter technologies, especially storage, EVs, and connected devices that are setting customers up to prepare for a future where they can participate with the grid. But I do just want to note that metering infrastructure is going to be critical for that. We have to make sure that customers can be rewarded for providing those grid services. And right now, we have limited capability of doing that. So energy efficiency, how does energy efficiency fit into this changing grid? Well, of course, we're going to continue to implement cost-effective energy-saving measures like we do now. but there's going to be a bit of a pivot to focus on strategic electrification. So as we do that, we've always thought about energy efficiency as reducing load. We're reducing the number of kilowatt hours you use, we're reducing your therms. What we're going to have to do is pivot to say we need to look at holistically at your energy picture. So if you're heating with oil right now, we replace that with a heat pump. Yeah, we're increasing your electric load, but on an MMBTU basis, we are overall saving energy and greenhouse gas emissions. And so that's kind of how we're pivoting to make sure that we're prepared for a future of strategic electrification. We're going to focus on peak load management and load shifting with all of those connected devices that customers are adopting at really rapid rates. We're doing that right now through the Connected Solutions program that I think you're going to see expand in the coming years to include more types of devices. And that is going to be a critical piece of allowing customers to flex their load and hopefully integrate more renewables that have variable generation. And a big one is potential support for renewable energy. So there are amendments to the Green Communities Act in 2018 that allowed for energy efficiency funds to be used for some language around technologies that accelerate customers adopting renewable energy, something like that. So we take that to mean we can support renewable energy installations with energy efficiency funding. So we want to do that carefully, but the culmination of all those comes into something that we have been working on, something we're proposing. We want to do, you can call it a pilot, we're proposing to use energy efficiency funds to install heat pumps, solar, and battery storage for low and moderate income customers who currently are not participating in those technologies due to the high upfront cost. We want to convert their heating from oil, electric resistance, or propane to those efficient cold climate heat pumps, offset that increased energy usage with renewable energy production, and provide battery storage so that they can use it for resiliency and we can use it as a demand response and peak shaving resource. So we're working on that now and plan to file that with the department later this spring. So I just want to end on, and I realize I went a little over time, but the role that you as consumers play in this future grid. So consumers used to be thought of as just ratepayers. It's a very passive term. You really didn't have a choice back then of who you wanted to provide your electricity, what resources you wanted to support, and you had pretty limited options to control your costs. You got the bill every month, you didn't really understand what you were using or why you were using so much or why your bill is what it is. Now, utilities and we, of course, think of you more as a customer. So you have choices for energy supply. You can choose to buy your energy from renewable sources, and there are a lot of tools, especially here, to help you control those costs and give you a little greater insight into what's going on and using the energy in your home. But the future, and you hear this term thrown around a lot, is prosumer. So hopefully in the future, you're going to have more comprehensive insight into what the end uses are in your home that are driving your bills, and the ability to control those costs, and the ability to interact with the grid in a way that we can't now by even selling those grid services through your connected devices, through your backup battery energy storage, and be rewarded for that. So it's really, at the end of the day, a more interactive grid rather than a one-way flow. So, sorry I didn't leave more time for questions, but happy to hear your questions, and thanks for having me.
Nice.
Yes.
What's the status of the resolution? Is it a cap? Where if you're gonna have solar in your house, you can't go over the amount of energy you're using now.
You mean your usage cap? Like you can't design a system larger than what you use by about 10%. Yep.
Yeah.
So the idea, just the background on that, is the idea is that the state, and of course utilities, didn't want to incentivize the overbuilding of solar. Ideally, behind the meter solar meets load on an exact basis, on an annual basis. And so the idea is that metering credits as a bill credit are structured so that you actually don't end up getting cashed out for any overproduction. So you're sizing your solar system to meet your load, because you really don't want to be pushing a whole lot of power back onto the grid. You really just kind of want to be self-sufficient on an energy basis. So that cap still stands. I think it's like 10% of your average annual. You can go over by about 10% of your average annual energy usage.
Well, if you want to encourage more output, why wouldn't you take away the cap?
Good question.
So the cap is on an individual basis. For small systems across the state, there's no cap on how many small systems can be installed across the state. It's a cap on how much what your system is designed to output. And frankly, I don't know how strictly it's enforced when you do your interconnection application. Yes.
If I could just follow up on that, another reason is actually the law of unintended consequences. Those that have installed solar tend to be more affluent, and the cost, because they're so heavily incentivized, are borne by the rest of the ratepayers who are moderate or low income. So rather than trying to incentivize a few by enabling them to be big systems and producing it, they're trying to incentivize the many. And that was just a public policy choice.
Yes.
Yeah, along that same line, or at least a similar line, we're seeing groups that use a significant amount of land, like landfill, parking lots, putting solar in. Is there any move, or what move is there toward more community-oriented generation as opposed to either mass scale or one-on-one?
Sure, yeah. So a lot of our open space has been developed on the Cape for municipalities, actually, through CBEC this year. They built a lot of landfill solar arrays, and now what's happening is actually they're running into a space issue where you have conservationists who don't want to cut down trees to install solar panels. What the state did with their last solar incentive program called SMART is they have a bunch of different adders basically on a per kilowatt hour production basis. If you are building a carport solar facility, you get a really high adder because that is smart use of space. Parking lots aren't doing anything else productive, so they may as well be producing solar energy. Likewise, if you're doing community solar, you get an adder as well. Community solar is a little more difficult to manage because you have a lot of end users and off-takers that, when somebody closes an account, opens an account, there's changes that have to, so it takes a little more active management than a single customer solar facility does. But the state does want to encourage community solar where possible, and is doing that by essentially providing a larger incentive.
Is it having much of an impact today?
There are definitely community solar projects being developed, if that's your question, yeah. I don't think because of those reasons about management, I don't think they're as common as large projects that are not community solar, where they're just selling to a few commercial customers, for instance. But they are being developed. There's one in Brewster, I think there's one in Bourne Marion, and I think NRG at the power plant built a relatively small one, but there's one there as well. Yes, sir.
You mentioned large commercial users adopting storage devices. Are they loading them up with their own generation, or are they just taking on cheaper kilowatt hours to supplant more expensive kilowatt?
Yeah, so I would say in Massachusetts, at least right now, wherever possible, they are loading them up with their own renewable generation specifically. The reason for that is if you charge it at least 75%, you can take advantage of the federal investment tax credit. Charge it at least 75% with renewable energy. You can take advantage of the ITC. If you charge it 100% renewable energy, you get the full ITC value for that storage asset, and that's a big incentive to charge it with renewable energy. There are storage facilities that basically do that pricing arbitrage that you talk about, where they charge it up at night, and when prices are low, and they discharge during the day when wholesale prices are high. Those tend to be really large facilities, like pumped hydro. We have a couple of those in Massachusetts. Not these smaller behind-the-meter facilities, but for large commercial customers, that is an opportunity. Yes.
This was an outstanding talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I have two questions. One is, what is the discussion probably at the policy level in terms of passive design for net zero energy use? And then the second one is, what is the discussion about decentralizing the grid. These connected grids give me the creeps. They are not secure, whether you're worried about weather or, you know, just breakdowns or terrorism or whatever. The more decentralized we are, I think the better.
Yep.
And so that may be one reason why Texas has their own system, because they are always worried about that. But
Yeah.
anyway, those two questions.
Sure, so on the net zero, I will fully admit I am not the efficiency expert among our staff, but I do know there's been a lot of discussion with the Department of Energy Resources around net zero and really pushing the program administrators to provide incentives that can get homes to net zero. It is difficult to achieve, especially without renewable generation on the facility as well, which to date, the program administrators haven't provided incentives for really. But that discussion is active at the state level, and that is what especially the more progressive energy activists are really pushing for. And local communities, through I think building code standards, can enact requirements around net zero, and we've seen some communities do that, I think. On the grid piece, one thing I didn't touch on that I thought about including is microgrids. And microgrids are a whole, you know, you can go, there are conferences around microgrids, all we talk about microgrids. But microgrids are essentially the idea where you can have a little mini grid that can be cut off from the larger grid. And on that grid are all the basic elements of the larger grid. So you have generation, and you have storage, and you have load. Storage is critical. So I think that as storage and renewable generation proliferate, we're going to see more opportunities for microgrids. The state right now is primarily doing that through grants. Several towns are looking at microgrids for some of their critical facilities. And I think that's where we're going to see it start, is with you know, government facilities, critical facilities at the government level. And then as these technologies become more affordable, and as the utilities are incentivized to incorporate microgrids or allow for microgrids, you're going to see them installed more often, and per your point, they are going to become more important as we have more outage events on the larger grid.
Is that discussion happening on the Cape?
Yes, actually. So several Cape Towns have applied for grants, or at least one Cape Town that I know of has applied for a grant to do kind of a study, because there's a lot of design work that has to go into that, and a big piece of it is whether you're using the utility infrastructure. I know that they talked about the Golden Triangle area in Sandwich as its own microgrid, and I think its own district heating system, which is kind of a related concept. So that is where, you know, the broader area, or that is the broader trend, is instead of having one large interconnected grid, which is going to be not as necessary as it used to be because we're no longer restricted to, you know, one-off large power plants, trying to carve that grid up into smaller pieces that can self-sustain if needed.
Great, thank you.
Yes.
Can we just tell them about DY?
Sure, yeah, so I'll mention, we're involved with CVEC, and CVEC is working on a DY battery project at DY that will essentially allow for islanding of that school, like a facility microgrid, you can kind of think of it as. I don't know if you want to say more about that.
No, I think one of the things we would note, if grid of the future, and it's very important to have these islanded, resilient microgrids.
Yeah.
The infrastructure needs to be upgraded to handle additional power.
Yeah.
And the real point of tension right now is who should pay for that? Should the people who are trying to build a microgrid have to upgrade the infrastructure, or should our utility be upgrading the infrastructure as part of their service? And how do you socialize those costs? So that's a big concern.
That's right. Absolutely. Any others? Yes.
Do you see trends of people getting off the grid with solar and battery power and
Trends of people, is that what you said?
getting completely off the grid?
Yeah, we call that grid defection. that's the industry term. You know, I think it's really interesting because 10 years ago that would almost be unthinkable. But as we see people installing 3 Tesla Powerwalls in their home that have a solar PV system, you know, technically it's been possible for a long time technically, but not really financially. And now it's starting to become less unaffordable as hell, but financially. And that is the other thing that I did mention that's really driving grid change, because the utilities recognize this, and if they don't change, customers are gonna say, I can do it on my own, I've had enough. And as more, if you get that wave, as more and more people leave the grid, those fixed costs are spread out among fewer people. And that's, if you're one of the last few on the grid, you're paying a really high electric bill, you're gonna say, I'm getting off the grid. So it kind of starts this chain reaction. And I think that if we don't see our utilities adapt, as these technologies become more affordable, that could be a big problem for them.